flashes, night sweats, foggy thinking, tearful, depressed. It can be vaginal dryness. A lot of that stuff that we think about related to menopause, really, menopausal symptoms. We can also have excess of estrogen, and I see that both in men and women. And when we see that, especially when there's adrenal fatigue, okay, you think, where's this excess estrogen coming from? It's generally from an outside source. So that can be from the food we're eating, especially meats and dairies, which have these added hormones. It can be from too much plastic use in our lives, which also influences estrogens in the body. Estrogen excess is definitely related to mood swings, tender breasts, water retention, a lot of those PMS symptoms, as well as like irritability, feeling anxious, and then things like fibrocystic breasts and uterine fibroids. So we know excess estrogen is quite serious for women, and especially people that maybe are susceptible to hormone-dependent cancers. The other thing with excess hormone, it's something that we can link closely together when we look at the lab testing, is high levels can also, they can be related to those excess outside sources and or liver congestion. So one of the jobs of our liver is to process extra estrogen in the body, and when it's not able to do its job because of too high an antigen or pathogenic load, or too many toxins in the bodies that it's just trying to keep up with, it slows down and estrogen can build up this way. Progesterone deficiency. So, okay, we see here that pregnenolone is going to progesterone to make cortisol, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we maintain our levels of progesterone. I see those two very low in people, and especially, we do hit a point where the body's doing whatever it can to make cortisol, but those cortisol levels are low. So absolutely then we expect to see low progesterone as well. Again, it's hot flashes, night sweats, memory lapses, bone loss, a lot of those same postmenopausal symptoms. It's quite interesting because I'm seeing more and more lately with like a handful of clients, women that are maybe around my age, maybe even younger than me, late 20s, early 30s, I'm more mid-30s, that are really having hormone levels that are equal to or lower than what you would expect to see in postmenopausal women. So it's happening, and then, okay, we can see where these symptoms are coming from, and, of course, difficulties with fertility and getting pregnant. Excess progesterone, so as I mentioned, these imbalances can go any way. Men, it also comes up with them that there's excess progesterone, and again, we have to look at where is this coming from. And a lot of times with that, you need to look to the household. There could be a woman in the house that's on a progesterone cream, and like, okay, you put on your cream, you touch the doorknob, not great for your husband, which is another reason that the liquid drops are really useful. With regards to having low estrogen levels, something else that I see quite often is even though estrogen is really low, we have to have enough progesterone in our body to be protective against the levels of estrogen that we have. So you can have a situation where estrogen levels are low, but you still have estrogen dominance, which just means that even at those low levels of estrogen, there's not enough progesterone to counteract the effects of the estrogen. Okay, I'm going to jump back. Rather than go down, if you could go back up to that chart. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, with the stages. So I talked about up to stage 2. So the third stage is stage 3. There is no stage 4. So from here, things are generally, they're pretty grim, and they can continue to worsen, but we just don't, put it in another stage. So at stage 3, people are really struggling. Here you can see chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. There's a lot of things going on. The body has entered a catabolic situation. It's basically breaking down its own tissues to try and maintain itself, try to keep up with those cortisol levels. There's also, at this point in stage 3, a lot of chronic symptoms. So people that I see in stage 3, their complaints have been going on for years. A lot of times they've been to a lot of practitioners, doctors, it could be a wide variety of natural alternative health practitioners, and they just, again, it hasn't gotten to sorting it from the underlying cause. It's always that symptom treating, which is why there really hasn't been much improvement. So how I work to identify adrenal fatigue is through functional laboratory testing. There's a lot of great tests out there. There's a few key ones that I like to start with for pretty much most every client that I see. The first test, it looks at those cortisol levels, so it takes a reading of cortisol 4 times throughout the day, as well as 2 forms of estrogen, progesterone, DHE levels, and also melatonin, which is another interesting hormone. So it's related again to sleep-wake cycles, but our body produces it in the evening to help us sleep, and it should be lowest in the morning when we wake up. We see very low melatonin levels, so you can definitely pinpoint that to sleep issues. But the other thing that's really interesting about looking at melatonin is it's a really good indicator to gut dysfunction. So 75% of our melatonin production is in our digestive system. And when that's really low, okay, there's a sign that things are going on with the digestive system as well, and that needs some support and some healing. I also like to look at how well the liver is functioning, so I have a test that looks at 3 things. The bacterial breakdown of protein, also related to gut function, level of liver congestion, and that's related to how well we're detoxifying, and maybe how much internal stressors and antigenic, pathogenic loads. That's from things like food sensitivities, from parasite or bacterial byproducts. So if we have bugs and we don't know about it, they're producing their own metabolic waste. They are also dying off, and our livers have to process that. This one test, it also looks at oxidative damage in the body, which ages us and is a contributing factor to illness. The third test that I really like to run with everyone is specific for gut function. So it's looking at immune responses to anaerobic and aerobic bacteria. It's looking at immune response to yeast, dietary proteins. Those are 5 main ones. So I have another test that's specific for 93 different foods or more than that. But it starts to give us an idea of, are you reacting to foods in your diet? And usually if that comes up, you're reacting to a lot more foods than just those 5 that they're testing for. So that's the basis for the testing. When certain things come up that give an indication, I will do testing that looks for parasites, bacteria, and yeast. And, we hear a lot about candida infections. Candida can be quite tricky to treat for a number of reasons, but a lot of times, not always, but usually if there's a candida infection, it's a secondary infection, not a primary infection. So like I mentioned, that bacteria and those parasites, they're decaying bodies. This is stuff that feeds that yeast. And so you can treat yeast, and until you get to that other thing that's feeding it, it's really hard to correct. And so some people think, okay, well, why not just jump into parasite testing? The reason for this is you really have to keep in mind that our bodies have to be able to host parasites and bacteria, whatever it is. So yes, there's some really pernicious, bugs out there, and you come in contact with them, you're going to be sick. But a healthy, well-functioning body actually, it can fight a lot of stuff off, and it has a lot of protective mechanisms. One being that, like gut function, that mucosal barrier, which becomes damaged over time from eating foods that we're sensitive to. Taking, could be medications that are interfering. So what happens when we start to damage the lining of our intestinal tract? We're not properly digesting food, perhaps, and undigested food passes through. This is called leaky gut. When that happens, the body, it stimulates an immune response to attack that. And we're also not producing the enzymes we were, because we have this villi, this brush border that gets blunted. So there's a whole host of problems, and I think, you really have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at gut function. You can't just look at cortisol levels. It's an overall picture of how well is the body functioning, and one doesn't necessarily cause the other. They kind of happen in conjunction to each other. So aside from the lab testing, there's really great supplements out there, but you can't, address this stuff with supplements alone. It has to be a full lifestyle protocol. You really have to look at diet. You have to look at exercise, and that can be not enough, but that can also be too much exercise, which is a big stressor on the body, and lifestyle, as well as sleep. So it's really It can be a long process to healing, especially with the gut. You know, when you start this stuff, symptoms can start to relieve quite quickly, but if you really are looking at repairing the gut, you know, it can be a year of ongoing work. So, okay, just to summarize, adrenal fatigue, it's basically chronic stress contributing to it, and our body just losing its adaptive reserves and hitting a point where it's no longer able to respond to the stress that we're experiencing, and to, you know, correct it. It's important to, you know, find someone to work with that you trust, and again, look at all those factors: lifestyle, supplement protocol, sleep, exercise. Any questions?